live from the Fox News desk.
Well, this one came out of nowhere, but really didn't catch a lot of people by surprise. We begin with breaking news and the bombshell report that has blown up the top spot at the Pentagon, ensuring that the United States goes even longer without a full-time confirmed Secretary of Defense. This as tension in the Middle East threatens to hit its tipping point. The acting Defense Secretary, Patrick Shanahan, today took himself out of contention to lead the Pentagon after USA Today published the details of a nearly decade-old violent domestic dispute with his then-wife. It reports that the FBI had been investigating the incident as part of a routine background check for all cabinet members, that incident from the year 2010, ahead of what would have been his confirmation hearing. According to the paper, Shanahan and his then-wife, whose name is now Kimberly Jordanson, both told police the other was to blame. Jordanson said Shanahan punched her in the stomach. He said he'd never laid a hand on her and told police she punched him 10 to 20 times. Shanahan confirms some of the information to the Washington Post and speaking about another incident from the year 2011. This one, painfully, involving his then teenage son. According to the reporting of the Post, quoting police reports, William Shanahan beat his mother, Kimberly Jordanson, with a baseball bat, fractured her skull, left her unconscious and in a pool of blood. At the time, Shanahan defended his son, saying he acted in self-defense. Now he tells the Post he was wrong and that there is never any justification for an attack with a baseball bat. The president says Shanahan withdrew from contention as defense secretary so that he can devote more time to his family. All of this as the Defense Department deals with brand new tensions, escalating tensions with Iran. And the fact remains, the United States of America has been without a Secretary of Defense confirmed by the Senate for almost 6 months and counting, the longest such period in our nation's history. Jennifer Griffin reporting live this afternoon at the Pentagon. Jennifer.
Shepard, eyebrows were raised as soon as it was announced that acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan would not accompany Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Tampa to meet with U.S. military commanders today. Clearly, the writing was on the wall for several weeks that Shanahan's nomination had hit a roadblock. In fact, his nomination hearing was supposed to be today. Just before Pompeo spoke, USA Today reported the FBI was looking into domestic violence allegations involving Shanahan and his ex-wife from nearly a decade ago, raising serious questions about FBI vetting him as Deputy Secretary of Defense when those allegations were public and part of messy divorce proceedings for more than a decade. Shanahan spoke to the Washington Post in recent days and revealed, as you mentioned, his son had battered his ex-wife with a baseball bat. Shanahan's resignation letter alludes to his children, quote, "It is unfortunate that a painful and deeply personal family situation from long ago is being dredged up and painted in an incomplete and therefore misleading way in the course of this process. I believe my continuing in the confirmation process would force my 3 children to relive a traumatic chapter in our family's life and reopen wounds we have worked years to heal. Ultimately, their safety and well-being is my highest priority. I would welcome the opportunity to be Secretary of Defense, but not at the expense of being a good father." According to the Post, the attack left Shanahan's ex-wife unconscious in a pool of blood with her skull fractured and internal injuries, which required surgery. Shanahan suggested there were some additional issues involving mental health and addiction based on court records and affidavits. Shanahan told the Post, quote, "Bad things can happen to good families, and this is a tragedy, really. Dredging up the episode publicly," he said, "will ruin my son's life." Shep?
So, Jennifer, now we'll have a new acting defense secretary. What can you tell us about him?
Today, President Trump tweeted he had decided on a new nominee for Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, who is already serving as Army Secretary, overseeing 1.4 million soldiers and guardsmen. He is a former Raytheon executive and from the same West Point class of 1986 as Mike Pompeo. He served as Senate Majority Leader Republican Bill Frist, Chief of Staff, and Policy Director for the House Armed Services Committee. He served on active duty in the Army for a decade, including service in the first Gulf War, with the 101st Airborne Division. Perhaps what is most notable, Shep, is how President Trump at first relied on a large number of Marine generals as his national security advisors. Jim Mattis was Defense Secretary, John Kelly and General Joe Dunford, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Now the Defense Secretary, next chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, all are from the Army. Shanahan's last day, we are told, is Friday. Shepard.
Jennifer Griffin live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. Now, Patrick Shanahan was one who replaced Jim Mattis. Remember, it was November of last year that Jim Mattis resigned. And frankly, the reason was a simple one. The president wanted to withdraw troops from Syria and Afghanistan. Jim Mattis thought that was a terrible idea, and he quit. So in came Patrick Shanahan. And Patrick Shanahan, with not a lot of experience in this sort of thing at all, came in and said famously, the Pentagon will not be known as the Department of No. He was largely in lockstep with the White House, especially John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. There were complaints that John Bolton would go and talk to his subordinates, sort of going around the chain of command. So let's talk about where we've been and where we're going in a very important department, especially given the high tensions in the Middle East. Michael O'Hanlon is with us for analysis, senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Brookings is a nonprofit public policy organization, and O'Hanlon specializes in U.S. defense strategy. Michael, thank you.
Shepard, good to see you.
How do you feel about where the Defense Department has been for the past 6 months without a confirmed defense secretary and where it seems to be going?
Well, first, I'd say, of course, it's regrettable we haven't had a confirmed defense secretary. This is not a good way to do business. But second, we've been lucky. We've had General Joseph Dunford as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He's in his 4th year. He's in his 10th year as a 4-star general, and he's one of the most admired people in any defense circle you'll be around. Not that he can completely compensate for the lack of a permanent defense secretary. And also, I think it's a tough day for Mr. Shanahan. Let's give him his due. I think he's done pretty darn well in the job as deputy, and I feel for his family story, as I know we all do right now. So I'm not a fan of the Trump administration in general, but I don't think the problem with leadership there is the #1 liability for the country at this point. I think with General McKenzie at Central Command, with General Dunford still as chairman, General Selva in his 4th year as vice chairman, some other good people will be okay. Mark Esper, I've known for 20 years, very solid guy, not a sort of Washington superstar in the sense of name recognition, but a West Point grad, as you said in your story, former soldier, former Capitol Hill staffer to Senator Frist. He knows the defense industry well because he worked for Raytheon, and he's been instrumental, along with General Milley and others at the Army, in coming up with the Army vision of the last 2.5 years, which holds together, I think, quite well. So he's a very workmanlike sort of guy. He's not going to be competing with sort of Mattis-like charisma for, public name recognition and the like, but I think he could do a solid job. And in the meantime, we've got Dunford, we've got McKenzie. So I've got my concerns about this administration, but it's not so much about Pentagon leadership.
Esper, 25 years in the Army, served in the Army, and then the Virginia National Guard. And he and Pompeo, I guess, got out of West Point at the same time and knew each other back in the day.
Yeah, although I think that the close relationship, at least the one that I'm aware of, is between Secretary Esper, and he already is Secretary of the Army, of course, so I can use that term correctly, even though he hasn't been confirmed as Secretary of Defense. But anyway, Esper and General Milley, currently the Army Chief of Staff, but the nominee to become the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, replacing General Dunford early this fall. Those two have worked hand in glove on the Army vision, the Army budget, everything Army for the last 2.5 years in the Trump administration. They have a common vision. They get along very well. And I think that could be quite a useful relationship as the Pentagon goes forward.
You know, Michael, nobody wants to be sitting up here 30 years into this and reporting on a family horror. You know, your son and things that happen in your own home. It's not fun doing it. The reason that this has become reporting is because this investigation dragged on for so long. The longest of any investigation like this in the history. This is a routine background check for any cabinet member. It's not something special to the defense secretary. It's very routine. And we could get no information. The people could have no information about why in the world can't you get the name for your guy up to the hill so we can begin confirmation process. What is the problem here? And then when all of this comes out, well, you have to explain it. you wonder why in the world, when they knew there are clearly problems almost 6 months into this, you can't even get a name to the hill. Clearly there are problems. If they had dropped this before, none of this reporting would have happened.
Yeah, you make a very good point. You know, and this should not be the routine way we do business in this country. We have a Secretary of Defense position for a reason. It's a crucial part of a national security decision-making structure. We've got a lot of big national security issues on the forefront. It's sort of good luck that we have the quality of a General Dunford as chairman, but that's not compensation for the civilian leadership. So it's not the way the Pentagon or the White House should, be run or do business. Again, I'm a supporter of Shanahan, but certainly not of the process that's gotten us to this day. Michael,
Thanks so much. It's always great to talk to you.
Thank you, Shepard.
And our best to all involved in that family situation with the Shanahans. The bigger problem in the world right now has to do with Iran. At the Pentagon, the leadership is in limbo. You've heard it's not like the hugest crisis in the world. We'll get through this. But tensions rising with Iran and the United States is very serious. We are a mistake away. Imagine a big mistake right now in the Persian. Imagine a big mistake in the Strait of Hormuz right now and what could happen. The U.S. is sending more troops to the region. We now know that. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the president does not want war. Iran says we do not want war. All say we do not want war. Yet the war drums are beating, and we are moving in the direction of higher hostilities. A live report from the State Department as our reporting continues this Tuesday afternoon. Iran now, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is meeting with top defense officials at U.S. Central Command, which is in the Tampa area, as the United States prepares to send additional troops to the Middle East. The Secretary of State says the president does not want war with Iran, but that he's calling for the United States to keep up the pressure campaign.
It's been our mission since the beginning of this administration to convince the Iranian regime not to move forward with their nuclear program and not to continue to engage in development of their missiles and all the other activities, the malign activities that they've been engaged in around the world. Now we need to make sure that we continue to do that so that we ultimately get the opportunity to convince Iran that it's not in their best interest to behave in this way.
Tensions have been building for a long time, going back to when the United States pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. But they erupted last week when the United States blamed Iran for attacks on a couple of oil tankers. Tehran denied responsibility, announced plans that it would violate the terms of the Iran nuclear deal, all for leverage. Yesterday, Pentagon officials said they're sending 1,000 additional support troops to the Middle East, not combat troops, support troops. This image shows the Air Force jets arriving in the United Arab Emirates. The Iranian president says his country does, quote, not wage war with any nation, unquote, but that Tehran will stand up to American pressure. With that, our State Department correspondent Rich Edson is live there this afternoon. Rich, to you.
Shep, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. strategy is trying to deter a war, not to start one. He was asked whether the United States is trying to communicate with Iran, either directly or through other countries. The Secretary says he's doing so publicly.
We're engaged in, we have been engaged in many messages, even this moment right here, communicating to Iran that we are there to deter aggression. President Trump does not want war, and we will continue to communicate that message while doing the things that are necessary to protect American interests in the region.
The Secretary also noted that the president gave Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe a message for Iran's leaders when Abe was in Tehran last week. Iran's leaders rejected that message from the president. They said they don't want to negotiate with the United States, where the president says that he's willing to wait on whenever Iran is ready. The administration is expanding its military presence again in the Middle East, and Democrats call the president's strategy erratic.
It seems when the president wakes up one morning, he says something, and then 2 days later he says something else. One day he says he's going to obliterate them, and the next day he says he wants to talk to them.
The Russians say the United States is trying to instigate a war. Secretary Pompeo says he wants to avoid one. Shep?
Thanks very much, Rich Edson, live at the State Department. Let's turn to Jerry Seib now. He's the executive Washington editor for the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal's parent company and Fox News parent company share common ownership. Jerry, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Read with great interest and reported at great length on your column from yesterday. I thought it was just laid out beautifully that the two sides are seeking leverage here, that the Iranians are looking for relief, sanctions relief, and they're doing it trying to get help from our allies, essentially overseas, and the United States is trying to get Iran to do what the United States wants it to do and come back to the table. The question is, during this push for leverage, how great are the risks?
Well, look, you start with the idea, which I think you've referred to already, that I don't think either side wants a war. There's a lot of downside to the U.S., and there's a lot of downside certainly to the Iranians if there's an out-and-out military conflict. So that isn't the goal. The question is, can you stumble into a war? Could there be a miscalculation? I kind of think it's not very likely that countries go to war by mistake, but it has happened in history. So it's a risky environment, and things can spin out of control, particularly when we have allies in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, who might have an interest in starting a conflict for their own reasons. And certainly the Iranians have proxies all around the region who have been doing their fighting for them, who have the ability to attack American targets, whether the Iranians intend that or not, and start something that nobody intends to happen. So the danger here is miscalculation as each side tries to increase its leverage on the other.
Your conclusion, though, was more of a question, really, about whether President Trump has what it takes now, diplomatically and otherwise, to get this done.
Well, I think there's a really interesting question about what's the actual ultimate American goal here, and I think there's a lot of confusion about that. Is it to actually create regime change in Iran, which National Security Advisor Bolton talked about before he came into office as something he would like to see? Is it to start diplomacy, which is what President Trump talks about? Or is it simply to create so much of an economic squeeze on Iran that it can't afford to start its nuclear program and can't afford to continue to send aid to its proxies around the region, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen? What's the goal here? What's the end point for U.S. policy? I think there's some uncertainty about that. From the Iranian side, I think it's a lot clearer. They're just trying to create, as we've been discussing, leverage. They want relief from economic sanctions, which are really biting hard. How do you get that relief? Well, you convince the Chinese and the Japanese that their oil supplies are at risk by blowing up a couple of tankers. And you convince the Europeans that the nuclear deal they very much want is at risk. You do that by saying you're going to break the deal. So the Iranians are looking for economic relief, pure and simple.
Could they win that leverage war? Are we in that sort of a position? Or is the jury out?
I think the jury's out. I've been talking to some people about that today. You know, the U.S. has a lot of economic power. European companies, European governments don't want to go against the United States. They can pay a high price in terms of economics and financial relations with the U.S. too. So I don't think they want to do it readily, but they don't like this situation, and so they may look for some ways to funnel relief toward the Iranians.
Like I said, the column's a really good one. It's at WSJ.com. Click on the opinion tab and you'll see it. It's great to see you, Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you.